In this third section, we will discuss the reasons why, despite the rapid growth, fixed income ETF adoption still lags equity ETFs. Fixed income ETFs are a relatively newcomer. They first launched in 2002, approximately 10 years after equity ETFs.
Well, there's catch up. I mean, to a certain extent, they've had a 9-year, 10-year head start in the equity space. But I think, equity ETFs are used by a really broad variety of investors. Both the big sort of active equity managers will use them for cash equitization, etc. Whereas fixed income, sort of pure fixed income active managers in the past haven't used bond ETFs as much because they are effectively an equity wrapper. And so incorporating an equity wrapper into your bond portfolio certainly used to feel not right. And so there's been a bit of an education in getting people used to that. And we're starting to see pure bond managers now starting to incorporate bond ETFs into their portfolios. But that's taken time. I think there's been a lot of chatter in the press around liquidity and fixed income ETFs, and it's a big topic, and it's something that we should all certainly be aware of. And I think that has put off a number of investors allocating to fixed income ETFs. And I think there's been obviously a bit of sort of cost pressures on fixed income ETFs, which is now starting to resonate and come through. But I think the difference between active and passive, wasn't so great as it was in the equity space when it came to fees. That's changing, and I think we'll see more changes there, which will probably entice more investors into fixed income ETFs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons actually that fixed income ETFs have lagged equities, if you like, it's partly because of the nature of the instrument. ETFs are equities. So the underlying liquidity and the liquidity of the vehicle are similar. That kind of naturally fits. With fixed income, you need to be a bit more smart about how you manage them. The other thing is that ETFs originated in the US. The US is an equity-owning society, if you like. So that's a big part of it. I think also there's some misconception about the nature of indices within fixed income. It's true to say that on an absolute basis, you own the most indebted companies. But actually, on a relative basis, it's not necessarily the case. If I buy the US corporate bond index via an ETF, two of my top 10 holdings are going to be Microsoft and Apple. So actually, you end up owning the biggest companies just as much as anything else. And on the sovereign side, of course, you've got the Japans and the Italys where you've got large debt levels, but actually you end up owning the biggest countries as well. There is some relationship between the relative amount of debt, of course, but actually it's the size of the economies and the size of the companies which matters more.
I'm not sure that product innovation right now is the thing that needs to drive growth in fixed income ETFs.
So what is it that drives growth?
I think it's an appreciation of what the products can bring to a portfolio management process more than anything. So I think an appreciation for investors as to how the market really works, understand that that's actually why spreads can be tighter on high yield ETFs than on the underlying bonds, on the basis that actually if you sell high yield bonds through an ETF structure, you don't necessarily sell the underlying bonds or touch the underlying bond market. Those units of the fund can stay warehoused. They may be passed to another market participant, and that means your actual cost of market impact is significantly lower.
I totally agree. I think the things that we're looking at are the things that will drive growth in fixed income. We look at cost in fixed income ETFs. Sorry, we look at cost, and not just TER, but cost of entrance, cost of exit, so spreads, tracking error. Those types of things which are all improving. The other reason we use them is liquidity transformation. The underlying corporate bonds are less liquid than the wrappers that are the ETFs. So that's helpful and that's improving. It's self-perpetuating to some extent. The ETFs are becoming more liquid as more people are investing in them, and that's a sort of virtuous circle. So.
I think that's where innovation has come in that area.
Yeah.
And in index provision, the fact that the ETF providers are going to index providers and saying, build me an index that does this what the client wants, and you've been speaking to us, other wealth managers, and finding out what we want and putting together that product matching the ETF. It's very good. And I think it's interesting us as well have to look at what indices we use, for example, for emerging market local debt, for example. We've all used this particular index, but it's a gross index, doesn't take into account the tax levels. But yet, for years in the equity space, we've used MSCI World Total Return Net, which doesn't take it. Why are we making it hard for ourselves when we should be pushing for, and we should change our benchmarks accordingly? But it's how the industry, especially in fixed income, is developing over time. And I think this will happen. This change will happen.
The development of indices and fixed income, it will help the growth of fixed income ETFs. I'm not talking about being too innovative. I think, as James said, we don't need to launch that many new products. But I think, 6 years ago, there wasn't really a big emerging market debt ETF in Europe. And so active managers had no competition from passive. What we've seen over the last 5 years in the emerging market local currency space is that active managers, for whatever reason, have underperformed the benchmark consistently over that period. And so therefore, we've seen a big shift of investors moving from active to passive in that particular asset class. So that will see growth. We've only in the last 2 years, we've launched the very first global convertible bond ETF. Active managers never had a passive, competition there.
I think if you saw a big aggressive sell-off in fixed income, that would actually help people's confidence in ETFs if ETFs are able to weather that period well. Because one of the debates that people have, rightly or wrongly, is we've not really seen how these types of vehicles will handle a 2008 type environment. Now, the Govies type ETFs, fine. But an EM corporate ETF where you've got, if everyone is trying to sell and you've got a very illiquid underlying, the vehicle itself, given the process, should be able to deal with that. The bonds get taken out of the product. But I think there's probably a little bit of a limited understanding of how that process works. And clearly, the whole market, whether you're active or passive, will be impacted by the technical sell-off. So I think that scenario will give a lot more. That scenario, assuming what I've said is right, that scenario would lead to more confidence in being able to use ETFs.
There is an element of investor and, dare I say in this building, journalist education as well around how ETFs work. So I know there have been some shocks around, and some journalists have talked about, it's moved to a big discount, not understanding the difference between a reported NAV and the indicative NAV. So, it's how it's going to be reported as well, because that will affect sentiment, and in turn that will affect the market.
Yeah, I think that's a key point in why bond ETFs are different. Well, the bond market is not exchange driven. The bond market contains stale bond prices. Therefore, the price at which you can sell the bond today might not be the price at which it was marked to market last night or last transacted. That impact will be the same whether you hold an active fund, whether you hold an ETF, or whether you hold the bond itself.